The year was 1587. Queen Elizabeth I had a vision to expand the British Empire across the vast blue horizon of the Atlantic. Under the leadership of John White, 115 brave souls, men, women, and children, set sail for the unknown. They landed on a small forested patch of land called Roanoke Island off the coast of present-day North Carolina. Life was hard. Supplies ran low. John White was forced to sail back to England for help, leaving behind his daughter and his newborn granddaughter, Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas. He promised to return soon, but war with the Spanish Armada trapped him in England for 3 long years. When White finally returned in 1590, his heart sank. The settlement was gone. The houses were dismantled. There were no bodies, no signs of a struggle, and no graves. The only clue left behind was a single word carved into a wooden post: Croatoan. 115 people had vanished into thin air. To this day, the fate of the Lost Colony remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in American history. Did they join a local tribe? Were they attacked? Or did they perish in the wilderness? The mystery of Roanoke marks the eerie, silent beginning of the American story.
17 years after the tragedy of Roanoke, England tried again. In April 1607, 3 small ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, sailed into the Chesapeake Bay. They established a settlement on a swampy peninsula and named it Jamestown, in honor of King James I. But Jamestown was no paradise. It was a death trap. The water was salty, the land was filled with malaria-carrying mosquitoes, and the local Powhatan tribes were wary of these bearded invaders. The settlers were not farmers. They were gentlemen and gold seekers who refused to work. By the winter of 1609, disaster struck. History calls it the starving time. Out of 500 settlers, only 60 survived the winter. They were so desperate they ate dogs, cats, rats, and, according to some archaeological evidence, even resorted to cannibalism. Jamestown was on the brink of total collapse. Then came 2 men who changed everything. First, Captain John Smith, who famously declared, "He who shall not work shall not eat." His iron discipline saved the colony from laziness. And later, John Rolfe, who introduced a new strain of Spanish tobacco. This brown gold became America's first cash crop. Jamestown didn't find the gold they were looking for, but they found something better, a way to survive and profit. The American dream had finally taken root in the soil. While Jamestown was struggling in the South, a different kind of dreamer was looking toward the North. The year was 1620. A group of religious separatists, men and women who felt the Church of England was too corrupt to save, decided to leave everything behind. We know them today as the Pilgrims. 102 passengers squeezed onto a merchant ship called the Mayflower. It was never meant for passengers. It was cramped, cold, and smelled of old wine and salt water. For 66 terrifying days, they battled Atlantic storms so fierce they cracked the ship's main beam. One man was swept overboard but miraculously caught a rope and climbed back up. When they finally sighted land at Cape Cod, they realized they were hundreds of miles off course. They were in a wilderness with no laws. So, before stepping off the ship, they signed a document that would change history: the Mayflower Compact. It was the first true step toward American democracy,
a promise to govern themselves. But the New World was unforgiving. That first winter in Plymouth was a nightmare of ice and scurvy. By spring, half of the Pilgrims were dead, but they refused to give up. With the help of a local Wampanoag man named Squanto, who spoke English, they learned to plant corn using fish as fertilizer. In the fall of 1621, they sat down with 90 Native American warriors for a 3-day feast of survival. This was the first Thanksgiving, a rare moment of peace before the coming storm of expansion. The success of Plymouth and Jamestown acted like a magnet. Soon, thousands of Europeans were crossing the Atlantic, each seeking something different. This was the birth of the 13 colonies, divided into 3 distinct worlds. In the north, the New England colonies, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire, were built on hard work, religion, and fishing. Here, the winters were long and the soil was rocky, but the spirit of independence was growing in every small town meeting. In the middle, colonies like New York and Pennsylvania became the breadbasket of America. Founded by the Quakers and the Dutch, these lands were a melting pot of Germans, Swedes, and Irish. They grew the grain that fed the New World and practiced a level of religious tolerance that was unheard of in Europe. To the south, Maryland, the Carolinas, and Georgia followed the lead of Virginia. The economy here was built on massive plantations of tobacco, rice, and indigo. But this wealth came with a dark, heavy price. By the late 1600s, the system of indentured servitude was being replaced by the brutal reality of African slavery. This divide between the North and the South, between freedom and bondage, was a seed of conflict that would one day tear the nation apart. By 1732, with the founding of Georgia, the map was complete. 13 separate colonies, stretching from the cold Atlantic forests to the sunny southern plains. They were British subjects, but they were breathing a different air. They were becoming something new. They were becoming Americans. By the mid-1700s, the American colonies were no longer just scattered outposts. They were a thriving, bustling society. But what was life actually like for the 2 million people living there? For most, it was a life of relentless manual labor. From the break of dawn until the sun dipped below the horizon, the sounds of axes hitting wood and plows turning soil echoed across the frontier. In the north, life centered around the meeting house and the church. Families were large, often with 10 or 12 children, because more hands were needed to run the farm. Education was a priority. The Puritans founded Harvard College just 16 years after landing at Plymouth. They believed that to be a good citizen, you had to be able to read the Bible and the law. However, as the southern colonies grew wealthy from tobacco and rice, a darker system took hold. The early indentured servants from Europe were being replaced by a permanent hereditary system of chattel slavery. Thousands of men, women, and children were kidnapped from Africa, survived the horrors of the Middle Passage, and were sold like cattle in the ports of Charleston and Savannah. By 1750, slavery was legal in all 13 colonies, but it was the backbone of the Southern economy. This created a massive social divide. While wealthy plantation owners lived in mansions, nearly 20% of the colonial population lived in chains. This paradox, the cry for liberty while practicing slavery, would become the greatest contradiction in the American story. For over a century, the colonies had enjoyed a salutary neglect. England mostly left them alone. But in 1763, everything changed. The French and Indian War had ended, leaving Great Britain with a massive victory, but an even more massive debt. The king looked across the ocean at his prosperous colonies and saw a solution: taxes. First came the Sugar Act, then the Stamp Act. For the British, these were fair payments for the protection of the redcoats, but for the Americans, it was a violation of their rights. The cry rang out from Boston to Virginia, no taxation without representation. Tension turned into violence. In 1770, the Boston Massacre left 5 colonists dead in the snow. 3 years later, the harbor turned brown as tea was dumped into the water in a daring act of defiance. The British responded with iron-fisted laws, closing the port and sending more troops. The colonies were no longer just 13 separate pieces of land. They were beginning to act as one. In September 1774, leaders like George Washington, John Adams, and Patrick Henry met in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They weren't asking for independence yet. They were asking for their rights as Englishmen. But the king refused to listen. The fuse was lit. In the quiet towns of Lexington and Concord, farmers were cleaning their muskets. The era of the British colony was ending. The era of the United States was about to begin. The world was about to be turned upside down.
April 19th, 1775. A single shot rang out in the morning mist of Lexington, Massachusetts. No one knows who pulled the trigger, but that shot heard round the world signaled the end of an empire. The American Revolution had begun. Against the most powerful military on earth stood a ragtag Continental Army, led by a tall, quiet Virginian named George Washington. They were farmers, blacksmiths, and merchants, untrained, unpaid, and often barefoot in the snow. But they were fighting for something the British redcoats didn't understand: home. The winter at Valley Forge was the ultimate test. Thousands of soldiers died from disease and starvation. Yet, in the freezing cold, a new spirit was forged. With the help of the French Navy and a daring strategy, Washington trapped the British at Yorktown in 1781. When General Cornwallis surrendered, the world stood in shock. A group of 13 tiny colonies had defeated the greatest superpower of the age. America was finally free. Winning the war was the easy part. Building a country was the real challenge. After the Revolution, the United States was a loose collection of states arguing over money, borders, and power. The first government, the Articles of Confederation, was failing. The dream of independence was slipping away into chaos. In the summer of 1787, the brightest minds of the age, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, and Alexander Hamilton, gathered in a locked room in Philadelphia. They weren't there to fix the old laws. They were there to invent a new kind of government. What emerged was the U.S. Constitution, the oldest written framework of government still in use today. They created 3 branches of power: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial, to ensure that no single man could ever become a king again. In 1789, George Washington was inaugurated as the first president. He was the only man in history to lead a revolution, win it, and then peacefully give up power to the people. The foundations were laid. The 13 colonies were now the United States. But as the 18th century ended, a new question arose. How far could this young nation grow? The frontier was calling, and the march to the Pacific Ocean was about to begin.
By the year 1800, the United States was a coastal nation hugging the Atlantic, but a hunger for land was growing. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson made the deal of a lifetime, the Louisiana Purchase. For just $15 million, the size of the United States doubled overnight, stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. Soon, a new phrase echoed through the halls of Congress: manifest destiny. It was the belief that Americans were divinely ordained to settle the entire continent from sea to shining sea. Thousands of families packed their lives into covered wagons and hit the Oregon Trail, braving cholera, broken axles, and treacherous mountain passes. But this expansion had a dark side. To make room for progress, the original inhabitants of the land, the Native Americans, were forcibly removed. The Trail of Tears saw thousands of Cherokee and other tribes march hundreds of miles to barren reservations, leaving behind a trail of graves. At the same time, the California gold rush of 1849 brought a frenzy of dreamers to the West, transforming sleepy hills into booming cities like San Francisco. The frontier was disappearing. America was becoming a continental giant. But as new states were added to the map, a deadly question arose. Would these new lands be free, or would they be slave?
After the smoke of the Civil War cleared, a new kind of revolution began, not with muskets, but with steam and steel. This was the Gilded Age. On the surface, America was glittering with gold. In the East, robber barons like John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie built massive empires, oil and steel, turning the U.S. into the industrial heart of the world. But while the cities grew tall with skyscrapers, the heart of the nation moved west. This was the era of the Transcontinental Railroad, a ribbon of iron that connected the Atlantic to the Pacific. It was the age of the cowboy, the lawman, and the outlaw. In dusty towns like Tombstone and Dodge City, legends were born. Wyatt Earp, Billy the Kid, and Jesse James. But the Wild West was disappearing as fast as it arrived. Barbed wire fences carved up the open range, and the great buffalo herds were hunted to near extinction. By 1890, the frontier was officially declared closed. The rugged, lawless wilderness was now a land of factories, mines, and sprawling railroads. America was no longer a collection of farms. It was an industrial machine, hungry for more. As the 20th century dawned, America looked beyond its own shores. In 1898, the Spanish-American War signaled to the world that the United States was no longer just a North American power. It was an empire. With the acquisition of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, the American flag now flew across the Pacific. Under the high-energy leadership of Theodore Roosevelt, the U.S. began to speak softly and carry a big stick. Roosevelt pushed through the construction of the Panama Canal, a feat of engineering that cut the world in half and gave the U.S. Navy total control of 2 oceans. The Great White Fleet sailed around the globe, a shimmering display of American steel and ambition. But the true test of this new power came in 1917. As Europe tore itself apart in the trenches of World War I, America reluctantly entered the fray. 2 million doughboys crossed the Atlantic, tipping the scales of history and securing a victory for the Allies. When the guns fell silent on Armistice Day, the world was forever changed. The old empires of Europe were crumbling, and the United States stood as the richest and most powerful nation on the planet. From a tiny, starving colony at Jamestown to the undisputed leader of the free world, the American journey was complete. But a new era was beginning, an era of jazz, skyscrapers, and a looming Great Depression that would test the nation's soul once again.
The year was 1932. The American dream had turned into a national nightmare. Across the Great Plains, a black cloud of dust, miles high and hundreds of miles wide, swallowed the sun. This was the Dust Bowl. Farmers who had spent generations tilling the soil watched as their livelihoods blew away in the wind. Hundreds of thousands of Okies packed their life's possessions into rusted Model Ts and headed west to California, searching for work that didn't exist. In the cities, the Hoovervilles, shanty towns made of cardboard and scrap metal lined the parks. Men in suits stood in bread lines, their dignity stripped away by a collapsed economy. Then came a voice of hope over the airwaves. Franklin Delano Roosevelt told the nation, "I pledge you, I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people." FDR's New Deal was a whirlwind of change. He created the alphabet agencies, the CCC, the WPA, and the TVA. Millions of young men were sent into the forests to plant trees and build trails. Dams were built to bring electricity to the dark corners of Appalachia. For the first time, the United States government became the guardian of the common man. But as the 1930s drew to a close, a darker storm was gathering over Europe. The Great Depression was ending, but a great war was beginning. December 7th, 1941. A quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii was shattered by the roar of Japanese engines and the scream of falling bombs. The attack on Pearl Harbor left the U.S. Pacific Fleet in ruins. The next day, President Roosevelt addressed a stunned Congress, declaring it a date which will live in infamy. Isolation was over. America was at war. What happened next was an industrial miracle. The United States became the arsenal of democracy. In Detroit, car factories stopped making sedans and started churning out B-24 Liberator bombers every hour. Millions of women, symbolized by Rosie the Riveter, flooded the factories to build the ships and planes that would save the world. America wasn't just fighting with soldiers, it was fighting with the sheer power of its economy. Across the globe, American boys, the greatest generation, faced the terrors of the Nazi Atlantic Wall on D-Day and the suicidal banzai charges in the Pacific. From the frozen forests of the Battle of the Bulge to the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima, the cost was staggering. The war finally ended in August 1945 under the blinding flash of the atomic bomb. The world was free, but it was forever changed. The United States emerged as the undisputed leader of the New World Order, standing face to face with its only remaining rival, the Soviet Union. The year was 1945. The smoke of World War II had barely cleared when a new kind of war began. One fought not with bullets, but with shadows, secrets, and the threat of total nuclear annihilation. This was the Cold War. On one side stood the United States and the dream of capitalism. On the other, the Soviet Union and the iron grip of communism. The world was split by an iron curtain. Fear gripped the nation. Children in American schools practiced duck and cover drills, hiding under wooden desks to prepare for an atomic blast. Families built fallout shelters in their backyards. But the rivalry soon moved from the bunkers to the stars. In 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first man-made satellite. America was in shock. The race was on. President John F. Kennedy threw down the ultimate gauntlet. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. On July 20th, 1969, the world held its breath as Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. The space race had been won, but the struggle for the soul of America was just beginning on the ground. While America was looking at the stars, it was failing to look at its own citizens. In the South, Jim Crow laws kept Black Americans in a state of second-class citizenship. They had separate schools, separate water fountains, and no voice at the ballot box. But in 1955, a woman named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. A spark was lit that would become a wildfire.
A young preacher named Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. emerged as the voice of a generation. He didn't call for violence, he called for justice. In 1963, standing before the Lincoln Memorial, he shared his vision. "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." The 1960s became a decade of profound change and tragic loss. The nation mourned the assassinations of JFK, MLK, and Robert Kennedy. At the same time, the Vietnam War was tearing the country apart, sparking massive protests in the streets. But out of the chaos came the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. America was finally beginning to live up to the promise it made in 1776, that all men are created equal. The old America was gone. A modern, diverse, and complicated nation had been born.
As the 20th century drew to a close, a new kind of frontier emerged, not one of land or sea, but of silicon and light. The Cold War ended with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, leaving America as the world's sole superpower. But the real revolution was happening in garages in California. This was the birth of the information age. Visionaries like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates turned room-sized computers into tools that could fit on a desk and eventually in a pocket. The creation of the World Wide Web connected the planet in a way never before imagined. Information, once locked in libraries, was now available to everyone, everywhere, instantly. America was no longer just an industrial giant, it was the brain of a global digital network. The 1990s were a decade of unprecedented prosperity. The dot-com boom created new wealth, and the world felt smaller and more connected. But as the clock ticked toward the new millennium, the technology that brought the world together was also creating new vulnerabilities. The stage was set for a century that would test America's resilience in ways no one could have predicted. The 21st century began with a blue sky that turned into a nightmare. September 11, 2001. The terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon changed America forever. The nation was plunged into the global war on terror, leading to long, difficult conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. At home, the balance between security and liberty became the defining debate of a generation. Yet, through the struggle, the American story continued to evolve. In 2008, the country broke a centuries-old barrier with the election of Barack Obama, the first African-American president. We witnessed the Great Recession of 2008, the rise of social media, and a global pandemic that halted the world in 2020. Each crisis tested the fabric of the nation, and each time the people adapted. From the starving settlers of Jamestown to the astronauts on the moon, from the battlefields of the Civil War to the server farms of Silicon Valley, the American journey is a story of constant reinvention. It is a story of high ideals and deep contradictions, of great suffering and even greater progress. As we look toward the future, the question remains the same as it was in 1776. Can a nation built on an idea continue to grow and thrive? The answer lies in the hands of the next generation of Americans.